The leaders of Germany, France, and Britain have stressed that the Ukrainian military must remain capable of defending the country's sovereignty. In a joint phone call with President Volodymyr Zelenskyy, they assured Ukraine of their continued and full support on the path to a lasting and just peace. A new U.S.-backed plan to end Russia's war on Ukraine would require significant military concessions from Kyiv that experts say would leave Ukraine unable to defend itself against further Russian aggression. The plan was drawn up by U.S. and Russian officials with no apparent input from Kyiv.
In a matter of seconds, Russian strikes tore through this residential district in Ukraine's southeastern city of Zaporizhia. Over a single day, Russian forces carried out nearly 400 attacks across the region, hitting 16 such settlements. Several people were killed and scores of Ukrainians left without a roof over their heads, just as winter sets in. As Ukrainians face daily bombardments, negotiations far from the front line are circling a possible peace deal. In Kyiv, U.S. Army Secretary Dan Driscoll met President Volodymyr Zelenskyy to brief him on a 28-point peace plan, reportedly hammered out with Moscow behind closed doors without Ukraine in the room.
Should face, and when we, the Army, look and see how well you guys have done, it's remarkable.
Thank you so much. We try our best with your support. We are thankful to President Trump. But to look at this,
Zelenskyy wants to negotiate further, insisting any talks must involve European leaders and must keep Ukraine at the table.
I expect to speak with President Trump in the coming days. We're aware that America's strength and support can bring peace closer in reality, and we do not want to lose that. But we also understand that Russia has no real desire for peace. Otherwise, they would not have started this war.
Nearly 4 years after Vladimir Putin's full-scale invasion, Russian forces now hold large parts of eastern Ukraine, including most of the Donbass region around Donetsk and Luhansk. The US-backed draft peace plan would lock in much of that control. It would require Ukraine to formally cede the Donbass to Russia, keep Ukraine out of NATO, with Allied fighter jets instead based in Poland to protect Ukrainian airspace, and cap Ukrainian armed forces at 600,000 troops, in exchange for security guarantees and sanctions relief for Russia. In Europe, many fear the draft could leave Ukraine negotiating from a position of weakness.
I still consider it to be a list of issues that urgently need to be discussed between Ukraine and Russia, not a final plan. It will be Ukraine that has to decide what compromises to make, just as Russia has to make such decisions on its part.
EU leaders say a workable peace plan needs buy-in from both Ukraine and Europe. Zelenskyy, meanwhile, has been careful not to publicly reject the proposal, cautious of straining ties with Washington. But with none of the key players on the same page, a deal to end the war still appears distant.
We're joined now by Roman Goncharenko from DW's Russia, Ukraine and Eastern Europe Department. Roman, Volodymyr Zelenskyy has so far been careful not to criticize the US-backed plan. What strategy do you see him pursuing in response to this proposal?
I think there could be three reasons for that. One, Zelenskyy is still hoping to renegotiate that peace plan. So he's going to talk to Donald Trump personally and persuade him to change it. He's also going to get support from Ukraine's European partners, also from Germany. And we should remember that the coalition of the willing, so-called coalition of the willing, so countries that are ready to do more for Ukraine and supporting Ukraine strongly, they have their own peace plan. And Ukraine would like to discuss that plan with Donald Trump. It is not quite clear as we speak if that could succeed. The second reason is, of course, Ukraine is very much dependent on the US military help. So it cannot allow any strong language. And the third reason is, I think, is past experience of President Zelenskyy, who already knows that criticism, public criticism of Donald Trump is not a good way to talk to him.
What are the chances, Roman, that Ukraine will accept the kinds of concessions that the plan calls for?
Well, it is difficult to predict anything at the moment, but I don't think Ukraine is ready for major concessions. For example, Ukraine, it's a red line for Zelenskyy and for Ukraine to just hand over territories that are under Kyiv's control. So where Russia wants to have those territories, especially in the Donetsk region, which is the biggest chunk of that part of Ukraine that Russia wants to have. So I don't think Ukraine is ready to go anywhere near a concession there. On the other hand, a lot will depend on the security guarantees for Ukraine. It's a key issue for Kyiv. And what we've seen in that plan so far has been very vague. It is not clear what will happen if Russia attacks again. So I could assume that if there are really strong security guarantees, and there are some options on that part, that Ukraine might do some concessions. But at the moment, it doesn't look like that.
The U.S. proposal, let's be honest about it, it echoes many of Moscow's maximalist demands. You mentioned territorial concessions already. It essentially strips Ukraine of its sovereignty. It was developed without any input from Ukraine or Europe. Why would the U.S. think that approach would be acceptable?
We don't know. We can only speculate. It looks like it could be that Russian President Vladimir Putin has promised something to Donald Trump, maybe some business opportunities. We see some parts, some hints on that in that peace plan about business opportunities for United States in Ukraine and with Russia as well. Russia can, of course, offer much more than Ukraine can. And we should not forget, Russia is at the moment winning on the battlefield. And that might be an issue as well. So Vladimir Putin could have said to Donald Trump or his representatives, look, we are winning, we are going to win, we are pushing forward. Ukraine is weak and getting weaker every day, every week. You are not ready to support Ukraine more. So you can either accept this deal or wait, and then you will have to accept it 3 or 4 months later. I think this could be the calculation.
What does this plan mean for President Zelenskyy personally? He's under tremendous pressure now, isn't he?
Indeed, he's probably under the strongest pressure since the full-scale Russian invasion in 2022. So he's under pressure because his army is losing territory. The Ukrainian army is lacking personnel. It's not much about the weapons, but it's about personnel. This is the reason why Russia is advancing in the east, but not also there, also in the south, which is very dangerous for Ukraine because it looks like they don't have enough not enough structures of concrete and metal and minefields, things like that, to stop the Russian advance in the south, in the region of Zaporizhia. On the other hand, he is, as you've mentioned, under pressure domestically, politically, because of that corruption scandal. And of course, pressure is growing also from the outside because of that scandal. So Zelenskyy is in a very dire situation. But on the other hand, I do not see that his position might be catastrophic. So I think that he still might find a way out of this. He's under pressure to hold elections, which is one of the points of that plan, one of the issues. And for that to happen, Zelenskyy might, I think he might consider that, but there is a precondition. So Zelenskyy needs a ceasefire, and a longer ceasefire. And he needs to be sure that Russia will not use that ceasefire to advance. So some options he has, but as you've said, he's in a very, very difficult situation under enormous pressure.
Roman, thank you very much. That was Roman Goncharenko from DW's Russia, Ukraine and Eastern European Department.
Well, the plan is asking for major concessions from Ukraine, but so far at least, Zelenskyy appears reluctant to criticise or reject it. DW's Kyiv correspondent Mariel has more.
And President Zelenskyy doesn't want to come across as intransigent. He wants to signal to the Americans he's open for dialogue. He wants to listen to their proposals. He wants to engage with them on a serious level. Now, apparently, they have moved on to the technical level and working on these proposals. So you really have to read between the lines here, because, of course, people are surprised. And, this morning, Ukrainians woke up thinking, oh, their president will, reject these demands and these proposals strongly. But yeah, as you mentioned, I mean, he's come, he put out statements saying that he's willing to talk. But nevertheless, he has also reiterated to work on the plan in a way that would bring about a just end to the war, a dignified peace that respected Kyiv's sovereignty. And also the Secretary of the National Security and Defense Council also just put out a statement saying these are Ukraine's unchanging principles: sovereignty, safety of the people, a just peace. So they still reiterate on these points. It just really remains to be seen how much of that and what is the interpretation of that, where are the red lines now? Because they've always said we have clear red lines, and it seems like with this proposal, with this draft, these red lines would be crossed.
Do you think that Ukraine will make big concessions then this time, or will be forced to Russia?
Yeah, it's really difficult to say at this point. I mean, we have to see what comes out of the talks between President Zelenskyy and President Trump. What is clear that these draft proposals, I mean, that's also what Ukrainians and the Ukrainian government has been saying. These basically reflect the Kremlin's maximalist demands. And there's nothing on the Ukrainian side where they couldn't say, we have a win out of this draft, because they are making all the concessions according to this plan. It's not the Russians.
Lots of Ukrainian concessions. What concessions, if any, has Russia had to make, or would Russia have to make in this plan?
None really at all. I mean, it would be only on the Ukrainian side. The only security guarantee that, according to a U.S. official who was familiar with this draft, would be that European fighter jets would be stationed in neighboring Poland. In case Ukraine gets attacked again by Russia, they would, respond to a possible attack. This would be like a security guarantee that is modeled on a NATO rule. So this is basically the only thing that Ukraine has as kind of a security. But of course, Ukrainians say we cannot believe Russia. They have made so many. We have had talks. They have made promises in the past. They've broken them. Why would we believe them now?
What does this mean for President Zelenskyy personally? He's been under a lot of pressure. How does he stand, going into these negotiations, do you think?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, he's been dealing for over a week now with this massive scandal, corruption scandal here in the country. People are angry and furious and upset. It involves a $100 million scheme involving kickbacks and money laundering, also implicating some of his top officials and one of his former business partners and former friends. So the Ukrainian parliament just dismissed 2 ministers of his cabinet, and they have also sanctions have been put on several close associates. So President Zelenskyy is under a lot of pressure. This U.S. proposal, this draft, couldn't have come, at a worse timing, and he is now facing the task basically to restore trust, public trust here among Ukrainians, and also having to deal with the Americans and coming across as open for dialogue, and we really, have to see what comes out of that.
Yeah, really, really, really tough time in the negotiations and in the situation there. Mariel, thanks for that. Mariel Mueller for us in Kyiv. Well, now let's bring in our political correspondent, Matthew Moore. Matthew, Europe was sidelined from these plans. Have there been any reactions from the German government to this peace plan?
Rebecca, it's probably worth just starting with the on-the-record response before we get into the background. So far, the Foreign Minister, Johann Wadephul, is the highest-ranking member of the government here to speak out, and he's essentially welcomed the initiative in this principle. But looking at the proposal, he said it was a list of issues that urgently need to be discussed rather than a final plan. And that, he said, he got from Marco Rubio, the US Secretary of State, with whom he held a phone call. And so there is the sense that this is not anything nearly done, but there's a broad consensus here among political and security officials that this 28-point plan is really a capitulation for Ukraine. Particularly concerning for Europeans are really the territorial concessions, which many here think would essentially just embolden Vladimir Putin. In that respect, there is a broad alarm here. Alarm not just at the contents, but also the process. As you mentioned, sidelined. Johan Wadephul admitted that none of the Europeans were aware of this, that these proposals were in the work. So just, again, it leaves Europe looking very isolated. The German Chancellor, Friedrich Merz, was due to speak to US President Donald Trump last night. That call never took place. This morning, Merz has cancelled a public appointment at a school. And we understand from sources that he is on the phones making calls to allies, and maybe even Volodymyr Zelenskyy. And we also understand that his official is really hoping to rearrange that phone call with Donald Trump that didn't take place at some point, hopefully in the near future. And then I suspect we will have a public statement from Friedrich Merz.
All right, Matthew, thanks for that update. Matthew Moore in our political studio.